Jango Fett, the ideal man for the template of all the clones of the clone army of the Grand Republic, and later, the Empire during Order 66 and beyond. Jango was a ruthless warrior who had fought his way up the ranks with his precision, abilities, and overall superior genetics. Dooku chose him as the template leader for the clones because of his ability to destroy Jedi during the Mandalorian Civil Wars, which can be read about in the comic series Open Seasons, or you can watch some of my videos on this. Now, what if I told you that during the original trilogy, The Empire Strikes Back to be exact, Lando was being fleshed out in the talks to be a clone, and that all clones would look and act like Lando? In the making of The Empire Strikes Back, George Lucas and his team discuss Lando's character as being a clone, even being compared to Spock and James Bond. Here's the paragraph, and then we can discuss things in detail. He's a slick riverboat gambler type of dude. Han Solo is a rather crude, rough, and tumble kind of guy. This guy will be a very slicked down, elegant James Bond type. He's much more of a con man, which puts him more in the Mr. Spock style of thinking, being smart, cool, and taking tremendous chances. An emotional Spock, someone who uses his wits rather than his brawn. He could be a gambler friend of Han Solo's. They're both underworld characters. This guy will have some kind of relationship with the Empire. He'll be pro-Empire, but he thinks he's smarter than the Empire. He doesn't really care about the rebellion, but in the end, he realizes that he must join the rebellion and that the Empire is terrible, which, as we can see, is exactly what happened with Lando. He was kind of pro-Empire, he was pro-Lando. Lando was pro-Lando. Lando was pro-money, pro-credits, even if it meant selling out his friends. Let's continue. Maybe he could look human, but not really be human. He's possibly a clone. We talked earlier about the Clone Wars. The princess doesn't trust him because of that. Leia might refer to him in a derogatory way. If we set him up as a clone, maybe in one of the other episodes, we can have him run across a clan of them who are all exactly like him. We won't go into the whole mythology of where they came from or whether the clones were good or bad. We'll assume that they were slightly weird in their own way and were partly responsible for the war. We'll assume that on these planets of clones, there are many countries, say about 700 countries, and he's from one of the ruling clone clans. I see him as a Rudolph Valentino character. 1930s hair, slicked back, wears white sport coats, white carnations, always wheeling and dealing like a gambler. Sly. Make him almost too perfect looking. We assume that in the cloning process, they manipulated genes and improved on the original. So this would have completely changed Star Wars. Imagine having Lando as the clone template in the prequels, and it was him who ended up possibly fighting Obi-Wan Kenobi. Now, George had thought about the Clone Wars all the way back in the 70s when he was writing Episode 4, and of course we hear Obi-Wan Kenobi tell Luke that he fought in the Clone Wars. Now, Episode 4 at the time was just called The Star Wars. There was no Episode 4, New Hope, but it was in the middle of the story. In fact, George Lucas's original idea for Star Wars, what sparked it all, apparently, was the battle on Mustafar between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and Anakin falling into a volcano. Now, many of you don't know this, but Han Solo was actually supposed to be on Kashyyyk in a deleted scene in Revenge of the Sith. His concept art was even drawn as a 10-year-old Dennis the Menace type of character. We didn't get that, of course, but it would have been an interesting tie-in to see so early and get a glimpse of his childhood. And maybe they could have done this later on, of course, in the prequels, seeing a young Lando grow up into the many clones of Lando. Now, as for them comparing Lando to James Bond and Spock, gives you a sense for where George wanted Lando to go as a character, or how he was to be portrayed. Much smarter, more cunning, and more smooth than Han Solo, which they portrayed very well in the film. As for Spock, that part confused me a bit until I thought more about it. Lando had to be very calculated, and this would have been perfect if he had actually become a clone. So maybe George was setting up the precedent for Lando to be this extremely calculating, perfect, so-called machine that was an organic human, but a genetically engineered clone of a template of Lando who was now just turned perfect through modulation of genes. The idea of enhancing the genes later once the original template was used is something I think they might be toying with for the Bad Batch. Perhaps that's how they were created. Maybe the Bad Batch are just experiments of toying with Jango's template, and in return, they got some clones who they can't control. It's an interesting theory that makes you think about it, but I don't really know yet. Maybe they're just defective. Maybe these are just experiments that possibly the Empire-to-be, Palpatine, had been forcing the Kamino cloners to do on these clones, creating Clone Force 99. And maybe they're going to use a lot of this stuff now that they originally had ideas for in the originals back in the 70s and 80s, but now they're going to put it to use for the new shows and new movies. Just like they did with the Ice Spiders, which was an original Ralph McQuarrie concept art design for The Empire Strikes Back, specifically to be on Dagobah, but we saw it in The Mandalorian Season 2, Episode 2. So there's always a chance of them bringing these things all the way back from, 30, 40 years ago and seeing them all again today. So let me know what you guys think of Lando possibly having been at least spoken about, at least talked about to be a clone and to be the one that actually, how would that have fit in the prequels really? How could Lando have been, he would have just basically conned everybody in the galaxy and been a smooth talk. Just imagine you have like millions of Landos throughout the galaxy smooth talking everybody. They wouldn't really need to fight. They would just swindle their way to get anything that they wanted. It seems like a pretty good idea to me. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this backstory, the making of books. By the way, this is from the making of The Empire Strikes Back, if I didn't mention that already. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like if you did, and I'll catch you in the next video. Until then, remember, my fellow Jedi and Sith friends, the Force will be with you always.